And then my dogs bark. Good morning and welcome to Happy Hour with me, Eileen Cook. Today is Wednesday and it's August the 7th, and I have absolutely no idea how that happened. Okay, so today I actually had a very specific question, which was actually a really fun one to organize, which was how do you moderate a panel? And I think this is actually a really good question because it will come up. And I'm also going to talk about how to be on a panel. So I'm going to hit a little bit of both because you might be on either end of those things. So first I'm going to yell at my dogs with mute on. 1 moment, please. The first tip to having a panel is don't have dogs. Okay, so one of the things that I think is useful to think about is that at the end of the day, the goal of a panel is to have an interesting discussion with interesting people. And I think too often it becomes sort of this question, person A answers, person B answers, person C says, yeah, pretty much what persons A and B said. And then person D just goes, huh, yeah, or talks for an hour about something completely unrelated. So that is what you are trying to avoid if you are the moderator. I would say the one piece of advice that I got that was the best advice I ever got on this topic was that you are not in the spotlight as the moderator. It is your job to point the spotlight. So I always thought of that as kind of a good way to think of it, and probably something that I keep in mind. So a few tips and things. Sometimes you actually get a say on who's on the panel. So that is always lovely if you have that opportunity. And the advice that I was given on that was to think deep. I don't know if anyone has ever heard that before, but by deep, they mean diverse, someone with expertise, someone who's eloquent, and someone who will come prepared. So basically diverse being all the things that we talk about now, which is, it's quite common, and I know I've been guilty of this. If I have to do a panel and someone says to me, who else should we get? I immediately think of all of my friends who are, you know, not necessarily a hugely diverse group of people. So thinking about who might be someone you don't necessarily think about, because different opinions are going to actually be what makes that panel sort of interesting. Expertise, you obviously want people who know something about the topic or have some reason to be speaking on the topic. Eloquent is just that idea of some people, I don't know if you've ever been on a panel with people where they'll be asked a huge question, they'll go like, yeah, yes. And then everyone else is like, okay, like there's not much to go for that. And on the converse side, you're also trying to avoid the people who apparently have been waiting their whole life to have the opportunity to have a microphone. And as soon as one is placed anywhere near their vicinity, it's like it's the, you know, Eileen Cook show, and they're just going to go off and do their own thing. So you're trying to avoid that. And prepared, which is you know, depending on what the topic is, doesn't require a ton of preparation. The deep actually comes from when I was doing panels where we'd be talking about things like neuroplasticity and head injury, where you wanted to make sure you had people who'd be prepared to talk about that topic. Most writers or readers are prepared to talk about books at any given time at the drop of a hat without doing a lot of preparation. But having people do a little bit of think is not bad. When I am the panel leader, I do try to make sure I know who my panelists are ahead of time, even if so I'm reading bios, I'm going on their websites, I'm taking a look, because I'm trying to find something that might allow me to know them in a way that is different than, that's the word I'm looking for, different than just the bio that's going to be on their website. So is there something about them that I can say that might be new or interesting or fresh? So taking the time to get to know them. I am going to be in the Whistler Writers Festival coming up here in September or October. I can't actually remember, sometime in the fall. And as the person who's leading the panel, the organization has actually that was the best, sent me all of the books for the people on the panel. So I am chipping my way through that. So I will have read at least one of their books. And I absolutely love the cat face in the very corner. That just made my day. So think about that and how much you can know. Like if you have to buy your own books, you may not have the opportunity to read everyone else's on the panel's book, but if you can get them, it's a nice thing to do. I think one of the most useful things is know your audience. So who is coming to your panel and thinking about what is it that they're interested in. So for example, I was recently on a panel at the library and it occurred to me that the panel moderators were really wanting to have a discussion about diversity in YA and what's happening with diversity and the role of feminism. And it was clear to me as we started talking that the majority of people in the audience were more interested in understanding writing and publishing. So their questions were far more around that topic. And if you notice something like that, that is the time, if you're a good moderator, where you might be pivoting slightly. So you're still hitting the core, whatever the panel was about, but you're also trying to respond to the audience. So that can be useful. Come up with questions ahead of time, because there's nothing worse than being the moderator and thinking like, oh, we'll have all this time for questions from the audience, and the audience doesn't ask anything. It's not one of life's great feelings, and I have been there. So one of the things is to have a much longer list of questions than you think you're going to need. And I tend to star the ones that I'm sure that I want to ask. I'm also asking people on the panel if they have anything that they would like to have brought up. So sometimes they're coming up with questions, and it gives you a chance to sort of do that in a group email format. You'll see in some places they're like, have a phone call or a conference call with all the people on the panel ahead of time. That's a great idea. Good luck. I have never in my life been able to wrangle a group of authors all at the same time to prepare a panel. Like people just, I don't think have the time or the resources for that, but they will respond to a group email. You may also want to ask if there's anything that people do not want to talk about, just so that you can steer the conversation from that, if at all possible. So for example, you might have someone on your panel who is going through something personal, and you happen to know that they're going through something personal. And you may have thought of a great question like, oh, Eileen, you're going through a divorce. How did that divorce shape your book? And I might be totally willing to talk about that. Or I might be like, please don't ask me anything about my own personal life, because I just don't want to discuss it. I've had people say like they don't want to discuss anything about their own children, just because they have a hard rule about not talking about their kids in a public place. And I've also had people say, I don't want to talk about anything to do with, for example, the most recent debates in YA. So people who are like, please do not bring up own voices and whether or not we should be talking, because I just don't want to get caught in that public space with that. So have some ideas ahead of time if there are going to be some no-go places. I think it will help you to sort of explain the rules to the people on the panel. And by rules, it's my nice way of heading off the idea that I always tell people I'm totally fine with other people jumping in. So if we were a panel and I'd asked Lisa a question and she had given an answer, and Christy thought, oh, that makes me think of something, like I welcome Christy speaking up as another person on the panel and saying, that's really interesting, Lisa. I wouldn't have put it that way. Like, have you thought about X or Y? So I totally welcome, and I want people on the panel to feel comfortable to ask each other questions. So I let them know that ahead of time. I also let them know that as my job as the moderator, I'm trying to make sure that we hear from everyone. So if Jenny is the mic hog, I want to tell her ahead of time, like in a nice way, and telling everyone, because I don't know who the mic hog might be. I'll say to people like, if you're going on for a longer period, I may have to cut you off. And that's not because what you're saying isn't, hugely important, but I just want to make sure we hear from everybody. So that way I'm hoping to sort of put a bug in everyone's ear that there may be moments where I don't want to hear from you, so shut it. And I may tell you to shut it in a nice possible way. You want to get there a little bit early for the panel, if at all possible, because you want to be the one greeting the other panelists when they get there and saying hello. I also do let the room know about the rules. So for example, if they're welcome to ask questions at any time, or if we're saving questions until the end. I also let people know if there are rules about questions. So one of the things I have now gotten in the habit of saying, particularly at book panels, is I'm sure you all have specific questions about your book, but we don't have time to answer specific book questions, so please make your question general. And that is to stave off Christy, who's going to be that person who's going to be like, yeah, Lisa, in my book, let me explain it to you first. So the book opens in 1865, and as many people may or may not know, that was when the Civil War, and you will get those questions at book panels because people are so excited. And I think oftentimes we're too nice and we let people ramble on. And the truth of the matter is, with the exception of the person who is having their personal discussion about their book, everyone else in the room is bored. They don't want to hear about that person's book. And if anything, it emboldens other people like Alyssa, who suddenly thinks like, well, if Christy can ask about her book, then I'm going to ask Lisa about my book. And now we've had 2 10-minute discussions on things that are not relevant to other people. So I let people know ahead of time, if you're asking a question that seems very specific to your book, I will cut you off. It's not that I don't think it's a great question, but I just want to make sure that what we're asking is relevant to everyone. So please make your question general, such as how do you incorporate historical facts if they're not necessarily work with your timeline? Do you have to follow the timeline or historical? That's a relevant question for everyone. You describing your personal book, Christy, with all of the details that happened during the Civil War is not relevant. So that's the kind of thing that I will look at. I think it's good to be a little bit funny, particularly if funny comes a little easy to you. If it doesn't, don't feel like you suddenly have to, yucca, yucca, yucca. But if you can be a little bit funny, I think people enjoy that. Feel free to go off script. So if you had a list of questions, but all of a sudden someone's asked something and it started a really great discussion, I think sometimes we feel like, well, I have to stick with my script, but don't. Like, if there's a great discussion happening, follow that discussion and let it be its thing. One thing that I read about that I'm going to incorporate because I absolutely love it was the idea of polling the audience. And the reason that this person talked about in the article, which I just loved it, is it's a way to get the audience involved while still moving through quickly. So we're going to say that Jenny has given an answer to how she deals with bad reviews. You could say, like, I'm curious, out of the audience, how many people think they would like to try a method like that? Yes? Raise your hand. How many people think they could never do what Jenny did? No? Okay. And it might be a way then to, one, start other questions. So, I find it interesting that everyone in the room feels like they wouldn't have the guts to do what you did when dealing with negative reviews. Do you want to talk more about that? But it also just, again, gives that audience a chance to sort of participate, which they kind of want to do, let's be honest. I'm going to have a couple more general things and then 2 specific things that I think are probably the ones that are most interesting to deal with. So one, keep an eye on the clock. So a lot of conferences, and if they don't, you can sometimes ask someone in the room, particularly if you know anyone in the room, to give you maybe a 10-minute or a 5-minute warning so that you know and you can start wrapping things up. I often will keep my phone right so down. I know some people will do a timer on their phone, so they'll have their, oh, I'm unstable. Am I back now? Okay. Some people will use their phone with a timer function on it, so it's counting down so that they can kind of consistently look down and see where they are with the time. You want to potentially practice, so asking some of your questions out loud, and particularly the things we're going to talk about next. So I'm just going to put a little tag on that one. And then put a bow on it. So that is the idea, like at the end of it, to say something like, okay, we only have a couple minutes left. One of the more common ones I'll do is like, and I warn people of this ahead of time, does everyone want to share what they've read recently that they are really recommending? And just quickly go down the panel. Or can everyone give one last piece of advice for new writers, or the best piece of advice? Make sure you've let your panelists know that question ahead of time so that they have something potentially prepared. But it's a nice way to kind of just, tie a bow on it. Or if your topic's on a particular thing, any last words you have on diversity, on, upping your page count, whatever that is, so that you kind of have the feeling like, and it's come to an end, versus being like, oop, and we're out of time. So that's just something to keep in mind. So the one thing I wanted to talk about is, and I actually wrote it in my notes, I wish you guys could see it, it's called Dealing with Assholes. It's a very subset particular question. And there are really kind of two kinds of assholes that you may be dealing with as a panel moderator. So the one which thankfully is not too common, which but can happen, is an asshole on the panel. And of course, the other branch is somebody who's in the audience. So if it is someone on the panel, you want to feel emboldened and empowered. You are the moderator. You are the person who was set by the conference or whatever it was to speak up. So if someone is going on for so long, or if you feel someone is potentially being bullying, it is okay to say something like, I'm going to have to cut you off there, Lisa. I think we're kind of stepping into something that might be a little bit sensitive for other people. So I'm going to take us on a different question. We're going to go over to Leslie for that question to start. So feel free to cut. That doesn't mean you have to necessarily, and I've seen panels where there are arguments. Typically these involve dudes. Like, you don't often see women getting into this kind of thing, but in general, if you can kind of look to maybe head that off a little bit, that's a useful thing to keep in mind. It's the same with someone in the audience, except it's a little bit easier. So you can say to someone, I'm sorry, I actually don't think that's an appropriate question, so I'm going to go to someone else right now. And then and if someone else, the asshole continues to speak up, you can say, again, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off. If you continue to speak, I'm going to ask you to leave the room. And the conference will, in fact, and you are better off to do it. And I've seen people who've done it where the rest of the room cheered, because every so often, and thankfully, like, it's never happened for me, like at Surrey, but it has happened to me at other conferences, where you occasionally get someone who has just got an axe to grind. I don't know if anyone saw the great interaction between Diana Gabaldon and the one heckler. This was maybe 10, 15 years ago at the Surrey conference. It's one of my favorite stories. So Diana Gabaldon I think it was a panel. At the very least, she was answering questions. And someone got to the mic and they were like, yes, as a Latina woman, is there a reason that you don't write about Latino men? And she was like, no, I'm just interested in Scotland. That's what I want to write about, or whatever. So that's what I write about. So then he got out of line, like got to the back of the line, waited till he came up again. And then he was like, but don't you feel you have a responsibility as a Latina woman to represent our culture in a positive way? And she was, again, very gracious. And she was like, no, like, I feel I have a responsibility to write about what interests me. And what interests me is Scotland. And so this is my story that I choose to tell. And then he got out of line and he got back up and he asked another thing, which I don't remember. And again, she was gracious, but a little bit more pert. And then he got in line one more time and he's like, is it just, you just don't find Latino men attractive? Is that what it is? And she said, you want to know? Well, then I'll be honest with you. The reason I write about Scottish men is because I like the idea that they could just lift their kilt and fuck me against a wall. Do you have any other questions? And like the whole room went, woo! and that was the end of his questions. Now, as a moderator, I probably would have had that guy pulled out of line, because it's clear after question 2, he has an argument he wants to make and wants to discuss that is not what the panelist is wanting to discuss. She handled it, I thought, with great aplomb all on her own and didn't need any additional help. But that is something that you have to keep in mind, that you are the one running the panel. Questions on running a panel?
Any strategies for reining in ramblers?
Wait for them to take a breath and then cut them off. So it's literally waiting, like where you can see people do the like blah, 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 blah. And as they're like going to inhale, I'll be like, I'm going to have to cut you off there because I want to make sure we hear more about that from Jenny. And they will sort of take a little bit of that. You can also sometimes do a thing where you raise a finger where you're indicating to them. That only works if they're looking at you, however. But if they are occasionally checking back, you can do what Lisa just did, which indicates she has something to say.
I was wondering about the same thing, but not ramblers. It's the ones that talk really slowly and say absolutely nothing. Any suggestions about them? Like we're working on 78 and they're working on 33, you know? Like,
yeah. It is a harder thing because it's easier, strangely enough, to cut someone else off than it is to be like, can you pick it up? So to some degree with someone like that, I probably, I don't let them go as long. Like, even though they may only be saying a 2 or 3 minute thing, like I will shorten them up because it's going to take them 5 minutes to get through it. And then strangely enough, I may look to them with questions that I know will be shorter answers. So like if I'm going to start something and I was going to have an open-ended question about what's your process, I'll be like, I want to talk next about process. Lisa, I'm curious to know for you, if you had to choose between being a plotter and a pantster, which one would you choose? And I'm looking for her to be like, oh, I would definitely prefer plotting. That's interesting. Jenny, talk to me about your process. So as opposed to asking a big question that might be a much longer answer, I'll look to be like, can you give me the one piece of advice that you found most helpful? Or what's your number one tip? Not what tips do you have for new writers, but what's your number one piece of advice? So I look to give them questions where I think their answers will be a little bit shorter.
I have another question. I've done this a few times now, and I find it to be, it's interesting each time. When you find the other person on the panel who wants to control the panel, like wants to take the room from you.
Yeah.
Like they're like, oh, I think we should do this next. And then they just sort of take the room and then they pull the conversation to one of their friends in the back of the room and they do it. You know, or the person who talks about their book, like they start talking and they're like nobody's read the book in the room. It's not like Diana Gabaldon where they've all read the book. Like this is somewhere where you can really pretty much guarantee that this isn't your guest of honor. This is someone who hasn't read the book. Like nobody's read their book. They're there to promote their book and they're talking nonstop about what they did in their book.
So there's two ways to handle that. Like I actually have said to people, like, I wonder if we can back away from your book because I'm not sure people have had a chance to read it. And people, you definitely should put it on your to-do list. I wonder if you can speak more in general. So still letting them have the moment to kind of plug their book, but then trying to pull them away from it. Again, hopefully I've let people know ahead of time, again, when I've talked to the rules about them, that I may cut you off, is I'll say something like, you know, it's my job to make sure we stick to a particular topic. So if I feel like the panel is going off in a different direction, I may cut that off. Again, that doesn't mean it's not going to offend someone if there's like, you know, they want to have the, you know, Rick and Judy show with the person in the back of the room. But I at least feel like I've at least spoken to them about it so it doesn't feel as rude when I say like, I think we're getting off target here and it sounds like you guys have a great conversation. The other thing I've often said is something like, be a great person to happen over lunch. Can you use your hand again? Everyone, if you're interested in talking about that more, look for this person at lunch. Oh, I went unstable. Did that come through? I saw I went unstable at some point. So encouraging people to have discussions outside of the panel. So if they're wanting to talk, like it sounds like there's, you know, at least a few people who really want to talk about blah, blah, blah. I'm going to suggest you guys meet up after the panel and find a great time to have that conversation. I'm going to turn us back now to whatever it is that our panel is supposed to be about. So that may help. So a few things, if you're the person on the panel, it's a lot of the same advice. So, you know, thinking about knowing your audience, knowing who else is on the panel. I do try to, for lack of a better term, sort of think about what the topic is ahead of time. So if the topic is strong female heroines, I try and think about like, what are examples, not from my own book, of heroines that I really like, and why did I like them? Having a few stories ready to go ahead of time is kind of a useful thing. So you have some stuff. Making sure that I'm making eye contact with people in the audience and people on the panel. So looking down and sort of being like, Christy, yeah, I want to ask you something about that. So kind of knowing that. And then keeping an eye on your moderator. Oh, as a moderator, how I love people who do this. So people who are looking back at the moderator, they'll often be giving you cues that they either want to move on to a question, or sometimes they'll be doing like, you know, this kind of thing. So I have been on panels where sometimes there's maybe one or two of us that are very comfortable with public speaking, and maybe two people who aren't comfortable with public speaking. So the moderator is becoming paranoid because I can see that they're running out of questions to talk about. And then I will talk longer. And I'll be looking at them so that if they want me to shut up, I certainly can. But if they're needing basically, let's bring this down, let's elongate that you can do that. Oh, one other tip that before I forget about it, because apparently I already did, is if there's not a microphone in the audience, potentially repeating the question that the person has asked into the mic will make things easier for other people. So, you know, Jenny calls out a question, and then I'll be like, okay, for those of you who didn't hear, Jenny was asking. This also allows you to slightly reframe it if you need to, or kind of, you know, get a little bit of clarity on that question if you want to. Other things on panels.
I have a question about use of vulgar language.
I don't know what you're talking about.
And I find this actually just even in my small classrooms, that sometimes you'll get somebody, and it's usually somebody, one of those younger folk, who like use the F word like for everything, like noun, verb, adjective, whatever. And that's just how they talk. But it's not necessarily appropriate for the room. I mean, sometimes it is. Sometimes totally fine. Have you ever run into that, like on a panel where you just have to say, okay, let's bring it down a bit?
So I sometimes will, for example, particularly again, knowing the room. So if I am speaking at a school conference, for example, I might remind people that we're talking at a school conference. And so if everybody can make certain to keep an eye on their language, that would be great. In an adult room, I think it's a little less likely something that I would police. And I think it's less like you'll see it from the panelists and more likely that you'll see it from people in the audience. So for example, I might do a slight chiding. So if, who have I not picked on in a while? Leslie asked an extremely foul and vulgar question with lots of use, because she's the one who would, let's be honest. All sorts of F-bombs in it. I'll refresh. She might reframe it as something. I might reframe it like, well, let me clean that question up a little bit. I think what Leslie was saying is, how do you deal with this or that? And so I change it slightly, but I also put in the chiding, let me clean that up a little bit, which might be a reminder for other people. Or if you need to, sometimes I'll just say like, I'm going to have to cut you off. I think it's a great question, but you have to ask it without the vulgar language. Like, sorry, we have kids in this room. I had the same thing. I thought Leslie was the one who was like, I'm out of here. And embarrassment of knowing that she's the foul and vulgar one in the crowd. So, and that's where it can be really useful to know your audience. So for example, if I'm leading a group on the Surrey conference, on the Friday is the Young Writers Day. And there's more likely to be kids in the audience. So that might be something, if I know I have a panel booked for that day, I'll remind people in the panel, like we may have young writers coming. So if everyone can keep that in mind as they're talking, that can be useful. I also can have a horrible mouth. So I actually, like when I do school presentations, I actually have a Post-it note that says, watch your language, that I put on my laptop, just so that I occasionally catch it and remind myself consistently. Just because I'm used to speaking to adults, and I sometimes will let terms fly, like asshole or whatever. And it's like, I just want to make sure not to drop that. Yeah. Look at this. Leslie is the filthy person. So I can't tell you how much that actually makes me really happy. I don't know why. And I mean, certainly you can look at, there's all sorts of books now from, Go the F to Sleep to the Gentle Art of Not Giving an F. All those kinds of things are certainly much more popular than they used to be. But I think, knowing your audience and being comfortable cutting people off. So that is, when I talked about practice, that is one of the best things, is practice so you feel really comfortable saying, I'm going to have to cut you off there because I want to make sure we have time to hear from Lisa on that topic, or any of those things, just so you feel empowered. Because there's nothing worse than being in the audience and having a panel hijacked where it's two people talking about their book and it's not at all what the panel was advertised to be, and you're stuck and you're bored and all that kind of stuff. So you do have an obligation to the people in the room, if that makes sense.
Any strategies for if the moderator's taking the panel in a direction that you haven't prepared for and is asking you questions you're not prepared for?
I hate when this happens. So one thing that I learned that was, I actually did a media training course that Penguin Publishing offered to all of its new authors, which was awesome. It's just like a little online video or whatever. But it was one of the most useful things that I got from that is the redirect. So it talked about always have 4 or 5 talking points that you want to bring up. And then you see politicians do this all the time, is to say, so we're supposed to be talking about strong female characters. And now the panel has gotten way off on diverse voices and racist issues in YA. And I'm not prepared to this, and I'm nervous to talk about it because I'm the only white kid on the panel or whatever that is. I would say something like, that's a really interesting question, Alyssa. And it makes me think about the issue of strong female characters in general, blah, 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 blah. So this is where your politicians say, that's a great question about healthcare. Let's now talk about gun control. So they'll sort of take something. And if it's done with a fair degree of confidence, often people in the audience don't notice that you're not answering the question that you are actually asked. So that's where I think it's helpful to have a few, whether it's stories or points or things that you want to bring up. So if, again, it's strong female characters, and I really want to talk about the importance of being interested in more than boys, and that, it's gotten off onto something else, I'll be like, and that is really interesting. And it reminds me of a real focus for me, which is blah, 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 blah. And then I go off again and I start talking about what I was prepared to talk about. And I think it is useful to, again, depending if you think you're going to come across this moderator again, giving them feedback at the end, like, wow, I wasn't really prepared to talk about that stuff. Just FYI, next time, if you're ever moderating a panel, if you let me know the kinds of things you might talk about, that can let me prepare a little bit. Obviously, every single question that I might get asked, because you don't know where the conversation is going to go, but I do at least try to be focused on that, if that helps. Other things? So I have something completely not related to that, but that I'm going to talk about because I think it's kind of interesting. I'm doing some research on another Creative Academy book on conflict. And one of the things, I'm reading a book called The Science of Positivity, which is dealing with all sorts of brain chemicals, and it makes my little neuroscientist heart beat fast. But in it, it's talking about how people at the mammal brain level respond. And so I think this is interesting to think about in terms of character. And again, I'm still figuring out how I'm going to write this up in a book, but stick with me because I think it's interesting. So they talk about when there is a threat in the wild, i.e. we are all zebras and we smell a lion. We have 4 responses that we can make. So the first 2 you're going to have heard all the time. The second 2 were not ones that I had thought about. You can fight, you can flee, you can freeze, or you can fawn. So we're going to talk about those because I think they're kind of interesting to think about from a character point of view, knowing that these are gut animal responses that we all have in us. So the book talks about the fact that fighting from an animal perspective is generally one of their least favorite responses. And the reason being, even a minor injury in the wild can have all sorts of major impacts. If you get a scratch, tousling with some other zebra cubs, a hoof scratch, if that becomes infected, you could die. If it means you're a little bit slower running, it means you might get eaten by a predator. So animals will avoid fighting in many cases. The exceptions being when either A, they know they're going to win and they want to assert some dominance. So in that case, they will fight. They will also fight if they feel cornered. So that's the idea. If you back someone into a corner, they will come out swinging. Or lastly, they will fight if they feel there's a matter of survival. So I've hunted a wildebeest. I'm all excited because I've been starving. So I have my little wildebeest. And then Leslie, who we all know is a huge vulgarian, comes in and she's going to try and take my wildebeest. I may fight for that because if I don't eat that wildebeest, I may not be strong enough to go hunt a new wildebeest tomorrow. So even though I might not normally take on Leslie over an issue of food, I might if that was on the case. So I think that's interesting when we think about our characters. Like if we're going to have them come out swinging, what's making them doing that? Knowing that most people are conflict avoiders. They're going to go with flee, our other option, right? So if they're not going to flee, if they're going to take it on, is it because they're sure they're going to win? Is it because they feel backed into a corner? And I think that's probably the one that is most likely in our books, but to think about how are you making it so that they feel they have no choice but to fight? Or potentially, is it something where they feel like they have no choice but to fight because it's an issue of survival? And of course, survival doesn't have to be real life and death. It just has to feel like life and death. So the second option, obviously, for animals is fleeing, which is get the heck out of Dodge and avoid that situation. And that is probably the number one option that most mammals will take when confronted with something, is they'll flee or they'll conflict avoid. And I think, to be honest, that's what most of us do in a lot of instances. So really thinking about, and I'm coming up again because I'm writing a book on it, all sorts of reasons that people conflict avoid. But for you to really think about, like, what is it that's making them not want to engage in it? Is it a past history with bad conflict? Is it that they just don't see it? Like, just take the stinking wildebeest, Wellesley. Like, I can't be bothered to fight you over this wildebeest. Is it, I think I'm going to lose, so I don't want to potentially lose? Like, really thinking, why is it that your character is doing it? Because there will be a specific reason. The next one is freeze. How many people know the saying, like a deer in the headlights? That's freezing, which obviously is not very effective against cars if you are a deer. But it actually does work with certain predators. So it's that idea, like you'll sometimes see something that's being hunted will just sort of be like, doink, and they won't move. And basically what they're hoping is a lot of predators' eyes only notice motion. So if you freeze, there's a very good chance the predator may not actually see you. So the brain has evolved, and in fact, animals that do that, their heart rate slows, as well as their breathing and respiratory rate will slow. So the brain is releasing chemicals that make that happen. But here's the thing is, we're not that much further evolved from our animal brain. So thinking about times that characters freeze, not necessarily like in motion, like, but where they sense some sort of threat and they just go still, or they just don't want to rock the boat in any way, shape, or form because maybe the threat won't see me. So I think that's a very interesting one that I personally hadn't thought about a lot. I was always thinking in terms of fight or flight. So to think about the idea of freezing and just, hoping that this thing will pass you by. And then the last way that the mammal brain deals with threat is fawning. And fawning is the idea of sucking up to the with the idea that if you are nice to them, that they will leave you alone. So you see this particularly in pack creatures. So this is the idea, like if you're a wolf and I see you and you're a dominant wolf, I'll roll over and show you my belly. Monkeys will do a thing where they don't look who they perceive to be dominant in the eye. This is why you're also told oftentimes if you're faced with an animal, like don't look them in the eye, because that's seen as a form of aggression, right? So you're looking away, making you, kind of hunching down. You'll see monkeys do this, like it almost looks simpering, like, yes, master, yes, right? But they sort of kind of go down and they'll do this thing where they'll fawn over or be extra kind to the thing that they see as dominant, with the idea if they do that, the dominant creature will not then be aggressive towards them. And I started thinking about that exactly, Leslie, in terms of bullied and how you will see sometimes someone who is a bully being surrounded by a group of people who fawn all over them with the intention of, if I'm fawning on them, then I'm not the target. I'm part of this loosely given pack. So I can't speak up to them. I can't say, hey, that wasn't nice what you did, but I will fawn all over them in this way of sort of making them feel comfortable and safe and all those kinds of things. So again, when we're thinking about characters, I think that is interesting. Separate to that, I've been reading books about relationships, and I have no idea what kind of political example you could be thinking of, Jenny. I'll ponder on that and see if I can think of it later. But I've been reading a lot of books about relationships and relationship dynamics, no particular reason. And one of the things that they talk about is the personality style of being a people pleaser, and people who will put other people's needs ahead of their own to sort of ensure that there's not conflict. And I think that's actually a form of fawning, right? It's this idea of giving into someone else or being deferential, right? So we're deciding, and I'm going to make it very simple. We're deciding where to go. And I'm like, I'd love to go out for Italian. And Alyssa's like, I'd rather go for sushi. And let's say I don't want to go for sushi. I really want to go for Italian, but I really want Alyssa to like me real bad because she's cool and she does things like kayaking and stuff. And she probably almost certainly could beat me up because she's way tougher than I am. So I might just be like, well, okay. So I'll roll over. I'll give in because I want her approval, even though that may cause problems. So the problem is, I think when we defer, when we kind of maybe flee, but we're not dealing with conflict, it's fine to some degree. Yeah. I'll still go, Alyssa, if you want to be my friend, just be my friend. But I will, if you defer and you put these things off, the problem that you may come up with, and psychologists, they call it gunny sacking, which is a horrible term, but it's the idea that you keep stuffing these issues and stuffing these issues, and eventually that will blow. And you see that happen in conflict situations, right? Where someone is not dealing with it, not dealing with it, not dealing with it, and eventually kaboom. So that is something that you can play with. So the big thing I want to think about is the idea of when you're looking at conflict in your book, realizing that you have a full range of kind of animal responses to conflict to choose from. So it doesn't have to be just fight or flee. There are a couple other options that you might want to think about. And also understanding that there's some brain chemistry that's happening around that because we developed habits. Alyssa.
I was listening to something recently. I think it was actually one of the swear word audiobooks, like Everything is After Book About Hope. I think it was one of those. And he was talking about how like your fight response is reflective of your personal experience. So if you're someone who doesn't get into confrontations, you can have a full-on flight or fight response with a very simple argument. And I actually had an experience with this earlier this week where I literally just told someone to leave the resort. Like, not a big deal, like no violence, no threats, no raised voices. But because he wasn't leaving, I was having this like ba-boom, 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 like, and feeling threatened, even though there was nothing. And I was like, wow, that's kind of an overreaction. But because I'm not a cop, I'm not generally telling people to get lost. It felt like a real altercation. So I think that's something to think about with your characters is what is their previous experience? Are they used to being in altercations? So something really simple can really affect your character. It doesn't have to be an actual fight.
So and here's the thing, when you're faced with a threat or a conflict, your brain actually, it ends up releasing cortisol. That's the chemical that shows up in your body, right? And that's what results in your heart rate speeding up. That's what results in all sorts of things, right? So your body starts to build up this cortisol. Then you're looking to release it because cortisol is unpleasant. Like, it's not a happy body chemical. It's no serotonin, my friend. Like are your body, like, you want to get rid of it. So you will look to release it, right? So you want relief from that situation. So you are much more likely to potentially lash out or whatever, but you will most likely go, just like water goes the path of least resistance, electricity in your brain goes the path of least resistance. So if you are someone who typically flees a situation, that's where your body is looking to discharge that cortisol. So you are much more likely to flee, and it gets reinforced. Strangely enough, this deals with, I don't know anything about this, but has anyone ever eaten their feelings? Hypothetically. So one of the reasons that becomes an ingrained habit is your body doesn't actually, your brain, though it's very smart, doesn't understand things. So if I'm really stressed and I eat a tub of ice cream and then I feel better, my brain now associates ice cream with the release of cortisol. So if I feel cortisol coming, my body will tell me, you need ice cream. You need to eat, right? Because my brain is learning. I don't know anything about shoes, Leslie. My brain is telling me if I have this thing, the cortisol will release, which is what I want to have happen. So I will do anything I can. And again, if you have ingrained habits, whether that's eating, shopping, drinking, those kinds of things, your brain has learned, and that's why addiction is partially so hard to overcome, is your brain is telling you in the same way your brain would tell you, let go of that hot stove. It's telling you you need that thing to get rid of the cortisol because that's how you've gotten rid of it in the past. So it's a very interesting kind of thing that's happening. And one of the other things that I knew from my previous day job, but was sort of interesting in thinking about conflict, is for your brain, it has no way to distinguish between emotional pain and physical pain. Because again, this is just a series of chemicals and electricity happening in your brain. So your brain gets, things from your nerve endings that say, oh, that's a hot stove. But it's not like your brain actually feels pain. It releases cortisol that tells you like, ow, that hurt. I should not touch the stove again. Right? So it's ingrained in that. But in the same way, if trusting someone has led to hurt, your brain is releasing cortisol, which is telling you, let go, that person's bad news. And I think that's interesting when we think about how we describe pain in our characters. We talk about his words hit me like a slap. It was like a sucker punch. My heart ached. It's a physical reaction. And I think that part of the reason that we do that is, in all honesty, for our brain, it is no difference if someone says something to us that is like, you're ugly and I never loved you. That can hurt as much as if they had hauled off and punched you in the face. And your brain actually doesn't know the difference. It's the same chemical that is released, and you will respond in that way. So that's what I've been reading about for the past couple of weeks and finding it very interesting and thinking about it in terms of character and in terms of how our characters make those decisions and what they're thinking about. And I wanted to sort of share it with you guys in that idea of different conflict responses and thinking about how your character has responded in the past, because then they have a neural pathway that is their default to doing that. So can you take away their usual way of dealing with something that will up their cortisol? So again, this is another reason why I think we sometimes get rid of supporting characters, because for a lot of us, particularly women, we discharge cortisol through social interaction. So I'm going to call my girlfriend and I'm going to tell Christy all about my heartache, and the fact of doing that's going to make me feel better, and it releases cortisol. So if I can't talk to Christy, and that's the way I normally discharge my cortisol and bad feelings, I'm going to, like, my anxiety is going to go up and be even worse, because that's not the way I can deal with it. So it's just putting more pressure on me. And is more likely to make me, basically trying to figure out what else to do, or may push me to having a bigger response than I want to have. So that gets into Alyssa's thing around, like, all of a sudden now I'm in a situation and I feel really uncomfortable and I don't know if I should just scream at this guy, get out, right? And then run away, or what I'm going to do. Whereas again, for someone who might be a cop, asking someone to leave a store feels like a low level kind of situation for them. So thinking about your character's experience with conflict, how they've dealt with it before, and can you maybe potentially take away some of their typical conflict resolution strategies as a way of upping the pressure. And then if you're describing conflict or emotional pain, really thinking about physical pain, because I think, just thinking about the worst pain that you can imagine, or where it happened, or what was going on with that, and seeing if you can then use it to be describing emotional pain. Because I think it will resonate with people. There's a reason we've talked, you always use those terms, like his words hit me like a slap or a punch to the gut, is because truly that is how it feels. Interesting stuff.
Can I just say something?
Yes.
My lovely friend, and I am always here for you if you need to.
Okay, thank you.
Get rid of the cortisol. Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's really interesting too. And again, I have no personal experience over the last month about this at all.
Okay, good.
But I think it's very interesting when you have a character who has responded in a certain way, and let's just say it's me, and say I'm a really logical person, and I respond usually in a very logical manner, and I rely on that logic. That's who I am. So I have characters in my books like that. But then you're confronted with something that causes you to think in a totally different way, and I find that really interesting. So kind of that, for lack of a better word, boy brain, when somebody comes along and they just are so ridiculously stupid and idiotic and inappropriate, and you're like, like your brain is not working in the way it should, and it causes you to act in ways that you really could not have predicted. I find that really interesting.
Well, and some of that has to do, I'm talking about, our enemy cortisol. But, there's things like dopamine and serotonin and various things that are being released, endorphins, that are being released as a way that are good chemicals, but also have different impacts. So for example, endorphins, the idea is to kind of give you a push when you need it. So it was really designed so like if you have to run away from a predator, it lets you keep going without noticing the fact that, for example, it might really be hurting. So it allows you to ignore normal pain signals. This is what's the runner's high is endorphins. That's what that is. Half the stuff Alyssa does must be endorphin based. I don't know what that she's doing, but it lets you override the normal part of your brain that would be like I should not be in this tiny little boat going down this wild, crazy river. Endorphins kick in and allow you to do those kinds of things. And it feels good, right? Like it gives you that like wee kind of feeling. But it also means that you're turning off other parts of your brain, right? So, which may make you behave in a very different kind of way. Alcohol has some of the same things, like it's taking down inhibitions because it's shutting off different parts of your brain that allow you to make different connections. And thinking about relationship that your characters have. So if you have a set group of friends, you probably already know this, that you have ways that you deal with conflict with that person that has been established for a long time. And you know how that interaction works. And it can be very hard for people when they then make a new relationship that doesn't abide by those same rules. So that's something to consider. Just ignore that. Hang on. We're not answering that. All right. Other questions on that? There will be all sorts of things about brain chemistry coming up in another book. So you'll know way more than you ever wanted to know about cortisol. All right. Well, if that is it, then we are at our 10 o'clock time. And I will see all of you around the academy. Have a good day. Thanks for the question today, Alyssa. It was perfect. Bye.